we mentioned earlier. I like to say it's like an X marks the spot because that's what the vehicles aim for when they arrive at the International Space Station. So one step closer to bringing Bob and Doug home. And we're actually really fortunate that the weather has turned out pretty good in the Gulf. Looking at a Pensacola landing site right now, we just, before we went on air today, we had the 2.5 hour prior to undocking weather briefing, and things are still looking good for an on-time departure today.
Yeah, really glad to see the weather cleared up. Storm moved back towards the Atlantic. Which opens up our opportunities for landing sites in the Gulf of Mexico, which Gary had actually mentioned earlier, Pensacola being the primary site today.
Yeah, so as they continue work on the A-Pass hatch, let's check in with Gary over on the International Space Station Mission Control Room side of things.
Stand by, Gary.
Thank you, Leah. We're watching the same view that you are seeing, Chris Cassidy working on that A-Pass hatch on the International Space Station side. As you saw, that hatch on the Dragon side closed. Now, this is an important set of procedures that Cassidy is working right now. You already mentioned the docking target. This is that rod with the X at the end of it. X marks the spot. As Leah mentioned, this is an important item to affix to that A-Pass hatch. Now, you see he set up a camera just outside of there, and he's also going to be taking some pictures for the ground teams to know exactly how the A-Pass was configured prior to closing, getting ready for some of those next crews. Now, you saw there was a white padding on the outside of it, too. That's just for a safety measure as the crew was moving in between the hatches, but everything going according to plan here. That A-Pass hatch expected to be closed about 10 minutes after closing the Dragon hatch, which was closed just about 10 minutes ago. So it should be closing very soon. The crew already just a little bit ahead of that timeline. So a few items coming up after that A-Pass hatch closure. Now you see that hatch is on the station side. There's going to be a space in between the Dragon hatch and the International Space Station hatch. That space is called the vestibule. So about 15 minutes after they close that A-Pass hatch, they'll give a go for depressurization of that vestibule. That is all controlled from the Dragon side. But we'll be watching very closely here in Mission Control Houston. Now, the depressurization of that vestibule does take quite a little bit of time. It takes about an hour, actually, to get down to vacuum, but there's going to be a check at about 5 pounds per square inch. The check at 5 pounds per square inch is going to take some time. It won't take too long to actually get to 5 psi, but once they actually get there, bringing that vestibule down to vacuum creates a little bit of temperature swings. So we need that to dampen out a bit before performing a reliable leak check. That leak check will happen at the 5 psi mark, and then we'll continue down closer to depressurization towards vacuum. Now, that's all coming up very soon. The go, no-go for actual undocking to occur a little bit more than an hour after depressurization. That at about 4:20 p.m. Pacific. And if everything goes according to plan, so far the crew a little bit ahead of schedule. We'll get them undocked right on time. We're looking at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going great so far from the International Space Station side. Now back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Now that Dragon's hatch is closed and Bob and Doug have donned their suits, we'll be looking for the A-Pass hatch on the station side to close very shortly. A-Pass is an acronym that stands for Androgynous Peripheral Attachment System. So you can see why we use an acronym, and it's an integral part of the docking system. Before closing it, we saw Chris Cassidy working to attach that docking target to fine-tune any alignment for the approaching spacecraft. So it's not something required for the undocking, but obviously we need it to be there for the next spacecraft that arrives at that port.
Yeah, and Gary had actually given us a...
Anna, I got you loud and clear. Good to talk to you again today. How's everything going?
Things are great. I'm super excited to be here.
So I think what we heard there was a comm check between the core here and Hawthorne Mission Control up to the crew. That's a very good sign. That means that they're well underway into their suit donning procedures. Suit donning just referring to getting into their suits. And one of the first steps there is checking that the microphones work both in the cabin as well as in their suits. Now, kind of what we were talking about earlier, once we get through suit donning, which will have a couple of steps involved in it, first with these comm checks, and then we'll actually do some pressure checks to make sure that the suits are leak tight. Once we get through that, then we'll actually go through a quick poll. Mission control teams will verify that we're go to depressurize the vestibule, again, which is that space in between Dragon's forward hatch and the station's APAS hatch on the mating adapter, pressurized mating adapter on the forward module.
And as you saw some flashes in that area down in the vestibule, that's Chris Cassidy, commander of the International Space Station, down in that space. He's taking pictures, and he'll be sending those back down to the ground team so that they can check out how the hatch closure procedure went, and he'll be able to provide those detailed photos for future use as well.
Yeah, vehicle actually undergoing a number of reconfiguration steps at this point. With crew, of course, on board, we have to make sure that our life support systems and thermal systems are all operating as nominal. And the volume actually in between in the vestibule, that pressurized area, which is now at about 14.7 psi, will actually vent that through some vent valves on the Dragon side of the system.
So one of the two astronauts returning to Earth in Crew Dragon is Doug Hurley, the spacecraft commander for the Demo 2 mission. He previously flew on 2 space shuttle missions as the pilot on STS-127 and again on STS-135, which was the final space shuttle flight. Here's a closer look at NASA astronaut Doug Hurley.
Very excited. Yeah, very excited.
You feel ready? Still pumped?
Oh, yeah. I think we're ready. I think we're certainly ready.
Joining the SpaceX Demo 2 test. He is a Marine Corps colonel and test pilot. He was selected as an astronaut in 2000. He piloted Space Shuttle Endeavour and Atlantis for STS-135, the final space shuttle mission. Introducing NASA astronaut Doug Hurley.
It's a life-changing process in so many ways to fly into space. It's just overwhelming in some respects. Just the sensations, the rumbling, the shaking, the acceleration. When the engines shut off and you go from, in the case of the shuttle, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs instantaneously and things start floating. And I remember distinctly just thinking, what just happened? To see a rocket launch in person is, it's a pretty emotional event. I remember the first time I saw a shuttle launch and it was amazing. And then when I saw a shuttle launch with my wife on it, that is quite the emotional experience. My name is Doug Hurley, and I'm the spacecraft commander for the Demo 2 mission to the International Space Station. We are doing the first crewed flight for NASA and for SpaceX. So this is the test flight to prove end-to-end from launch to docking to ISS operations and then entry, descent, and landing. We'll wake up about 6 hours prior to launch. You'll eat breakfast, you'll do a medical check, you'll start to get your comfort garments on, you'll get a weather brief, and then you'll go get suited up. And it's the same suit-up room that astronauts have been using since Apollo.
And there they are, NASA astronauts.
And then we'll walk out, jump in our Teslas, and we'll ride to the pad. We will board the vehicle roughly 3 hours before launch, go through all those pre-flight checks, and then ideally we're off to the races from there at launch.
Ignition, liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
It's about a 9 to 10 minute ride to orbit. We'll go through the on-orbit activities. We'll do some manual flying of the vehicle. We'll obviously sleep on the vehicle. And then we will continue through the rendezvous phase to where we end up in front of the space station the next morning, ready to dock.
Endeavour, this is Houston. Bob and Doug, welcome to the International Space Station.
We'll spend likely a few months on space station. We'll be able to do some on-board training with regard to undocking, entry, descent, and landing. Actually getting to fly the mission with Bob, we've been close friends for almost 20 years, so, the whole experience for me is what we're looking for.
For Doug personally, he's worked so hard, through his entire life to get to where we are right now. It makes me so happy to see that he gets to be part of this mission, the spacecraft commander. I'm just glad to see his hard work and his dreams come true for that. We're so proud of him.
It's been a huge amount of sacrifice and time away from home, but the fruits of our labor are coming to fruition.
Now, with Doug is NASA astronaut Bob Banken. He's the Joint Operations Commander for Demo 2. He previously flew on 2 shuttle missions, STS-123 and 130, and he also served a tour as the Chief of the Astronaut Office. Why don't we learn a little bit more about him?
When you go through the launch day preparations, there's a lot of moments that kind of stand out to you. One is the kind of the celebratory piece of it, which is that you're walking out of the suit-up room and getting in the vehicle that's going to take you to the launch pad. When you close the hatch, that's really when Doug and I are in the vehicle, and it's our vehicle, and we're really in control of the mission at that point.
Test pilots, their task
on the big
that
loop.
man
We
could
are
fly into orbit around the Earth
when you are,
return live and well to talk about it.
Section 1,
There's always a balance of managing risk as you go forward to execute a test point and figuring out a way to collect the data. We hear a sound. Okay, is that sound an expected sound? Or we see a light. Is that light an expected light? What's the source of it? Does it sync up with something else that's going on or not? So trying to dissect all of that in real time in your head is, a lot of things happen like that on launching of a vehicle.
From St. Anne, Missouri, he is an Air Force colonel and flight test engineer. He flew aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour twice. Introducing NASA astronaut Bob Banken.
My career at NASA has kind of spanned a couple of decades at this point. I arrived with the class of 2000, went through the training program, primarily focused on the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station, learning those systems. Having launched a couple times on vehicles, the second time was definitely different than the first time. You can feel a little bit guilty of, hey, should I study one more thing, or is there one more piece of information I should get? Am I really prepared or not? So that's definitely different between where I was on my first flight and where I'm at right now.
I think for me personally, as a spouse, watching everything that Bob has put into this over the last 5 years, the dedication that he's shown, the perseverance is pretty special. For both of us, though, the way our minds work, it won't be until sort of the mission is complete that you have really a chance to savor it and celebrate it.
On a deeply personal level, I'm really excited that my son is going to get a chance to see me launch into space. Being an astronaut has been a little bit of an abstraction thing for him because he's seen me do it in old videos, but he hasn't seen me do it for real. And so I'm excited for him to see me launch into space. Really, my role on the Demo 2 mission is to make sure that we get this vehicle tested and evaluated so that we can move on to more operational missions at the International Space Station.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA. Go SpaceX. Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
We've we've got a lot of objectives on board the vehicle that we need to accomplish to really make sure that it's good to go. We'll do everything from actually talk from the Dragon vehicle to a Russian Soyuz. We'll dig out all kinds of hardware that's stowed in the nooks and crannies of the vehicle so that we have a good feel for how things are in place and getting them back in place. We plan to do all those things as just a part of our test mission.
Welcome to Bob and Doug. I will tell you, the whole world saw this mission, and we are so proud.
I'm looking forward to that moment when he enjoys the accomplishment, when he realizes we did this. We did a great job. We accomplished what we set out to do. Whenever he lets himself feel that and experience that success, that's what I'm really looking forward to for him. For me, I'm looking forward to when he touches down at Ellington in the NASA plane that brings him home again at the end of it.
I think that the thing I'm most looking forward to is actually ending up in the water safely at the end of the mission. I'm expecting a little bit of vomiting maybe to happen in the end game. So when we get to that opportunity to do that, I'm looking for that kind of celebratory event for both of us in the water at the end of the mission.
So cool. Great view on your screen. That's from a camera behind Bob and Doug. Bob sitting in the right hand as we see him.
Dragon in 2.5, 2 successful leak checks.
Dragon SpaceX, we see the same. Thank you.
So there's confirmation of a couple of great milestones. Forward hatch is closed. Suit donning is complete. We just completed suit leak checks. Everything nominal. Bob and Doug just raising their visors, get a little bit more comfortable.
I love this view because it makes me feel like I'm in the back seat of Crew Dragon, just going along for the ride. We did have, as you mentioned, A-Pass hatch closure during that brief video, as well as the beginning of suit leak checks. I've got a few milestones coming up. Next, we'll be looking for that vestibule depressurization, bringing that space down to a vacuum. That should be happening very shortly, hopefully within the next 5 minutes, actually.
Yeah, so again, on your screen, left-hand side is spacecraft commander Doug Hurley. Right-hand side is spacecraft pilot Bob Banken, and also joint operations commander. In front of them are the 3 touchscreen displays in the Dragon spacecraft. And with suit leak checks complete, the next major milestone, as you mentioned, Leah, is vestibule depressurization.
So you can see they're checking out all their screens. The crew will actually be monitoring during the departure portion of the flight. On the way up, they had a couple of opportunities to perform some manual flight tests by piloting the vehicle and checking those out and seeing how it would fly if you ever had to. But fortunately, it is an autonomous vehicle. So the goal is that the astronauts are along for the ride, there to monitor and there to step in case anything were to go wrong. But it should be an autonomous flight home. We're not stopping for any of those flight tests along the way.
That's right. Just trying to take a look here to see what the vestibule is currently pressurized at. Taking a look at the data, it's about 14.1 psi, so pounds per square inch. For reference, at sea level on Earth, we're at about 14.7 psi, and if you're about 1,000 feet above sea level, then you're actually at about 14.1. Just happened to look that up earlier today. It looks like we might have lost the camera feed, might be another handover.
Probably so. We are waiting for that vestibule depressurization to begin. We're getting calls from the crew that they're getting ready for that. So things are moving along smoothly. Everything is happening on time for an on-time departure from the International Space Station today.
Yeah, and that call will actually be the ground side. We'll do a couple of checks, make sure that we're go and all of the data and telemetry on the Dragon side of the vehicle looks good and on the vestibule sensors look good. Then there should be a call to the crew from the core, letting them know that that we're planning to step into commanding vestibule depressurization, and then we'll actually issue that command. For this command, we are in joint operations. So what that means is the flight director in Hawthorne or in Houston at Johnson Space Center, the flight director of the International Space Station has mission authority for the mission. And any commands that we want to issue to the spacecraft will actually have to get permission from the flight director. And so some of those calls will be happening in the background before we actually begin that depressurization.
Dragon SpaceX for status.
Go ahead, Anna.
The ground has verified system reconfigurations for hatch closure are complete and they are nominal. The ground will step into vestibule depressurization shortly. And finally, control of cabin air temperature via your procedure 4.080 is allowed at this point, and note that the hex is currently configured for maximum cooling.
Okay, copy all, 4.080 if we need to change the temperature. Appreciate it.
And some words going up to the Crew Dragon crew from, as you mentioned, the core, the crew operations responsible engineer here on the ground at SpaceX. They spoke with the teams in Mission Control Houston and decided, yes, they are almost ready to begin that depressurization of the vestibule. This is the exact opposite procedure that we saw on the way up. And sounds like vestibule depressurization has begun. So as we mentioned, working to bring that space down to a vacuum in preparation for Dragon to depart today. That depressurization call coming at 3:04 p.m. Pacific.
And moving pretty quickly, data shows we're currently at about 12 psi in the vestibule. Just dropped below 12, and only less than a minute ago we were at 14.1. And should only take 5 to 10 minutes to drop down to that 5 psi holding point that Gary had mentioned earlier.
And that hold will be for 25 minutes while the teams make sure the depressurization is due to the actual removal of the pressurized atmosphere and not a change in the temperature inside Crew Dragon.
Yeah, a little bit of physics there. If you expand a gas, which is what's happening here, we're taking the gas in the vestibule and venting it away, and so taking the molecules in that vestibule and sort of expanding them out, the temperature tends to drop, and so we'll want to wait for that temperature to equalize, because as it warms up, the remaining gas will bump up a little bit in pressure, and that can look like a false leak from either the International Space Station side or the Dragon side. So we give it some time to equalize the temperatures, and once we feel confident that the pressure is stable in the vestibule, then we actually perform the leak check and look to see that we don't have a drop in cabin pressure on the Dragon side, as well as a rise in pressure in the vestibule.
And things are moving quickly. We are actually already at 8.5 psi, it's pounds per square inch, in the vestibule. And as you mentioned just a moment ago, we were at 14.1. So at 8.2 now, and then we'll be waiting for that 5 psi point where we'll do that 25-minute hold.
Yeah, and kind of wild to think, among the other fun facts I was looking up, so the pressure at Everest is about 4 psi. So that'll kind of give you a sense of this the pressure in the vestibule right now would be about similar to you being at maybe like 12,000 or 13,000 feet.
Yeah, and very interesting. That's near the same pressure as in an EMU, or an extravehicular mobility unit, that the astronauts use when they go outside on a spacewalk. They keep that at 4.3 psi. That way they are more able to easily move their fingers and their joints, so that that work outside isn't as difficult.
Now, something interesting to note on the extravehicular, or on the EMUs. So at that like roughly 4 psi, where you're not breathing the same mix of air that you would be breathing here on the ground. Here on Earth, we'd be breathing something like 70% nitrogen and then about 20-something% oxygen. You actually need the concentration of oxygen to be higher. So when you go to those lower pressures, those suits actually transition to oxygen, right?
And taking a look at the data, it looks like we are at 5.9 psi in the vestibule. So coming up pretty soon, we should be expecting that call of having reached that 5 psi level that we're waiting for that 25-minute check.
Mission controllers that you can see on your screen, specifically who we refer to as the systems officer, will be monitoring for the pressure. We'll also be looking for temperature checks on that area. The systems officer is actually responsible for the life support systems and thermal system on the vehicle, and so they're most familiar with that telemetry and able to make those calls for nominal leak check complete. And they'd also be responsible for checking that the vehicle configures into appropriate transition modes.
And I just heard that the initial depressurization of the vestibule is complete, looking at 5 psi, nearly on the dot.
So I think what we can expect next is a call from the core up to the crew to let them know that the thermal hold period is beginning. And then we will probably also hear when the leak check is complete and the results of that leak check. So we're kind of listening to the nets in the background. Just heard a conversation from the mission director prompting operators on next steps for start of this thermal hold period and then the leak checks. Bob and Doug really just sitting tight in the cabin at this point in their suits, able to monitor all this information from their 3 touchscreen displays in the vehicle.
Yeah, and we heard that we're about an hour and 20 minutes from the opening of the undocking window, so they get more than one chance today to undock. On the way up, we saw the astronauts really only had that single second that they had to launch so that they would line up perfectly with the International Space Station. It's a little bit different coming home. Those burns will really be what help us line up with our targeted landing site. Right now, looking at Pensacola and a scheduled splashdown tomorrow.
There's a view on your screen. Left-hand side is the International Space Station. So that's coming from Node 2, or the forward node. Looks like Commander Chris Cassidy taking a look down the PMA and sealing up the hatch. Probably checking the seal there, it looks like.
Yeah, probably checking it for FOD, or foreign object debris, making sure that there's nothing, even a minuscule hair, that could impair the hatches from getting a good solid seal. So it looks like another handover of our TDRS satellite systems. Those are tracked. The flight controllers know when to expect those, and so they can target their communications with the crew and any of those operations around that as well.
And now would actually probably be a great time to kind of hear what the mission control team in Houston is doing and what's going on station side. Gary, can you give us an update?
I sure can, Shiva. We're seeing the same results of the vestibule depressurization. It went down pretty quick, but again, as you said, we're looking for that thermal stabilization before we perform the leak checks. We saw good leak checks from the crew's suit-up procedures. The suit's looking pretty good. And then we just saw Chris Cassidy aboard the International Space Station finishing out his closeout duties of the pressurized mating adapter. That was that long tube on the other side of the hatch that he just closed, putting some items there, getting ready for the next crew coming up later this year. He closed the APAS hatch and configured that. for closure and taking some closeout photos and checking for any foreign object debris, and then eventually closed that node 2 forward hatch. That'll complete Chris Cassidy's duties really aboard the International Space Station for today. The primary role of undocking monitoring actually goes to Bob and Doug, with Mission Control Houston flight controllers monitoring from the ground. Chris Cassidy will be able to go inside the cupola. The windows are the shutters of the cupola windows are scheduled to be shut, but he'll be able to open them for situational awareness, take some good closeout photos of Dragon departing. Right now, we're just, again, in a holding period for that vestibule depressurization, holding rock steady at 5 pounds per square inch, 5 psi. That is the final step. That is the final step, final check, really, for vestibule depressurization until we get down closer to vacuum. Then, of course, we have the go, no-go for undocking coming up in just about an hour, and then eventually we'll get to separation, right now scheduled for just after 6:30 p.m. Central Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Everything looking good from the International Space Station side of things. Again, Cassidy's duties really wrapped up for today, closing both of the station hatches. With that, we'll continue to monitor this thermal stabilization, ready to continue depressurization of the vestibule coming up here shortly. With that, we'll pass it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. On your screen, a view from that camera, looking at Bob and Doug's console.
So when Dragon undocks today, it'll actually weigh over 27,000 pounds. We're looking at 27,600 pounds. Of course, in microgravity, that's nearly nothing. And they'll have about 3 days worth of food and snacks on board. So we're planning on them to get home tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow midday for us here on the Pacific Coast. And so those 3 days of food and snacks are there just in case there were to be some weather crop up that wasn't expected, and they can remain in orbit for a couple of days after undocking and be perfectly fine.
Yeah, that's right. The supplies that they have on board are really there in case we had a wave-off scenario. So if we were to have some kind of weather come in or something happen to the spacecraft where ground teams would want more time to troubleshoot and understand and see if they could recover fault tolerance on the vehicle, that would give them time to do a couple more orbits and then try again at another opportunity. Right now, vehicle looking very healthy. It's been very healthy the entire time it's been attached to station. Actually, the entire period while we were attached to space station, we were doing weekly checkouts on the vehicle of the life support system, thermal system, power system, and the prop system on board. And spacecraft has been pretty solid the entire mission.
So while we are in this holding period right now of depressurization, we're holding at that 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch, to make sure that there is no difference in temperature that's really causing that to fluctuate. A look ahead at the undocking, we are expecting to see undocking last about 5.5 minutes. And during that time, undocking for Dragon looks a little bit different than for other vehicles. When the Soyuz is on the International Space Station, it undocks by using springs that push it away from the space station. And Dragon will instead use a couple of undock burns. So 2 small, short burns, about 1.5 seconds for one of them and 5 for the other, and those will just do just enough to bring Dragon away from the International Space Station so that it can conduct its departure burns later.
Yeah, Dragon actually has 16 Draco thrusters on the base of the spacecraft, 12 in what we call the service section of the spacecraft, and 4 that would be underneath the nose cone around that forward hatch. The nose cone Dracos, the forward bulkhead Dracos, as we like to call them, are actually disabled for this portion of the mission and will be disabled for the next 3 expected burns, which would be that undock 1 burn, undock 2 burn, and then what we refer to as departure 0, which gets us on a path out of the approach ellipsoid and the keep-out sphere around the International Space Station. So these first 3 burns will actually only use the 12 service section Dracos. And we actually have that many because of redundancy on the vehicle. So we could lose certain combinations of those thrusters and still have full dimensionality control and the ability to control the vehicle's position applied thrust to it.
So if you're wondering what's keeping Dragon attached to the International Space Station right now, there are 2 sets of hooks, 6 on each side, so 12 hooks. And when that undocking sequence begins, the hooks will open and the umbilical, which provides power from the space station to Crew Dragon, that will detach, and then those short burns will fire and Crew Dragon will be on its way.
Yeah, those 12 hooks, hard capture hooks, are actually what also provides the seal as well. So they ensure that the vestibule has that leak-tight seal. And on the way up, when we docked in late May, that was one of the major milestones after we had attached, verifying that the soft capture system had completely closed and that all those hooks had driven closed.
So as you can see, NASA astronaut and commander of the International Space Station, Chris Cassidy, he's staying behind on the International Space Station for right now, and he'll return to Earth aboard a Soyuz in October. But he has just closed the Node 2 hatch. So the APAS hatch was closed earlier by Cassidy. The Dragon hatch was closed, and now just even creating a more firm seal by closing that Node 2 hatch. And as you mentioned earlier, that's on the front end of the space station, if it really had a front side. So that's where they are at. And you saw him taking some pictures, recording that process, and he'll be able to deliver those to the ground later for analysis and just to check out at how everything went, this first departure for Crew Dragon with a crew.
Good view from the interior of Dragon. We're looking at the pilot side seat. So that's Bob Banken, and you can see Doug Hurley's hands on just behind him.
Hey, Chris, that call came down on Space to Ground 1, so I'm just going to read back on the big loop that we confirm.
And if you actually look on the right-hand...
The Node 2 forward hatch and the MPEV are closed. And Chris, I owe you shortly what the undock sequence time is.
And that was a call to Chris Cassidy on the space station, checking out and making sure that they were just echoing that they saw that Node 2 forward hatch closure. Things progressing well for an on-time departure. When Doug and Bob got into the spacecraft today, they had a few housekeeping things to do. They wanted to make sure those footrests that you see right there are firmly attached for the ride home. And then you can see a window over to the right of your screen. Those have had some window covers on them. They removed both of those, but they are still available so that when the crew go to sleep later tonight, they'll be able to put those window covers back up. That'll keep them from seeing a sunrise every 45 minutes or a sunset, because the space station, as we mentioned, is orbiting Earth at 17,500 miles an hour. And so they see quite a few beautiful views, sunrises and sunsets every day, 16 to be exact.
Yeah, and you can actually kind of get a sense for how bright that might be. Spacecraft and the International Space Station are currently not in the Earth's shadow, so in sunlight, and you can see how bright the window can get, almost rivaling the lights in the cabin. Now that window is actually right next to the side hatch, so you can see there's a black strip next to that window. That's actually a handrest, a handhold, and next to that is the side hatch. And that's actually what Bob and Doug will be egressing out of after they do, after successful reentry, parachute deployment, and splashdown.
Yeah, so that's what we saw the crew climb in. Once they crossed that crew access arm, that last place that they were on Earth in that white room, they climbed in through that side hatch, but that's not what's attached to the International Space Station. The nose cone on Crew Dragon opens up and, as you said, exposes those thrusters underneath, and they actually floated through that hatch. So they arrived through that one and departed through that one, but once they get back on Earth, that side hatch is the primary egress or exit from the vehicle for Bob Banken and Doug Hurley.
Yeah, and actually one of the steps right when Bob and Doug had entered the vehicle on the launch pad was to do a leak check of that hatch. Hatch remains sealed the entire time while we're in space, and really only gets opened once we're back safely on Earth.
So pretty noteworthy about this mission, there are a lot of firsts for this mission. It's our return to flight from American soil for the first time in 9 years, since the space shuttle program. And it's also going to be the first splashdown in over 45 years. So actually on July 24th, just a couple of weeks ago, that was the 45-year anniversary of the last Apollo capsule splashdown with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So it's been a long time since we've seen a crew splashdown. That typically happens with a landing. Of course, the shuttle was an orbiter and could land like a plane. And then the Soyuz, which astronauts have been arriving in for the past 9 years, that lands on land in the steppes of Kazakhstan. So this one we're looking to land in the Gulf Coast. It means a much quicker ride home for Bob and Doug once they get back.
Yeah, once we get through the Earth's atmosphere, we'll have 2 drogue chutes deploy and then 4 main chutes deploy, and then splashdown currently targeted for Pensacola, so off the west coast of Florida. And recovery actually looks a little bit different than it did 45 years ago. So we have some pretty cool recovery boats, have helicopter pads on them, as well as a what we refer to as it's as an A-arm, but it's basically a crane on the back of the spacecraft. So excuse me, on the back of the boat. And a couple of fast boat teams will go out to the capsule, verify that it's safe to approach. Then that boat will come up, scoop up the Dragon spacecraft, put it on the deck. They'll secure everything and then open up the hatches and help Bob and Doug egress on the recovery ship.
If you've ever seen any of that old Apollo footage, the astronauts actually used to get out in the water. And so a little bit different this time. The crew will be waiting until that boat arrives with that crane to lift them up onto the deck, and they'll get the chance to get out on the boat instead of on the seas.
Yeah, and actually for recovery, we have 7 potential recovery sites, what we refer to as supported landing sites. So those are areas where a recovery team can get there very quickly, recover the crew within a couple of hours of their splashdown, but usually actually much faster than that. So we've got 4 sites in the Gulf Coast on the west, or in the Gulf on the west coast of Florida, and then 3 sites on the east coast of Florida. One of them, of course, being Cape Canaveral.
So as we were watching this past week, this tropical storm become a hurricane, there was some concern about returning today because we do have some recovery criteria. Landing in the water is a lot more difficult than landing on land because you have to consider things like wave height and wind speed. And so we are looking at those spaces in the Gulf, and they're looking pretty good compared to, obviously, the spaces on the east side of Florida. But yes, we have to take into consideration what the helicopters can arrive in and what all the boats can withstand and what the vessel, the crew capsule itself can withstand.
Yeah, that's right. The hurricane Isaias moving up, I think, the east coast of Florida now, so hopefully folks are staying safe out there. I know Doug actually took some photos from the cupola of this hurricane as it's moving up the east coast. But luckily, no major impact to weather on the west coast. Good winds, no significant lightning, no significant rain is projected for the area. And I think importantly as well, the wave heights, which are important for the spacecraft, but also for the recovery ship to be able to get close and for teams to secure the spacecraft and ensure that it's safe for recovery.
So currently we are in a hold period of the vestibule depressurization. That's the area between the hatches that the astronauts fly through or float through when they arrive and float through when they depart. So we are holding at 5 pounds per square inch for 25 minutes to make sure that checks out, and they continue with depressurization after that. But Bob and Doug, as you can see, this view over their shoulder, it makes it look like we're on the ride with them. They have donned their suits. They are in their seats, monitoring everything on those screens aboard Crew Dragon.
Why don't we actually check in with Gary at Johnson Space Center in Houston, hear how things are going on the space station side, and how do things look at Johnson, Gary?
Hey, Shiva, things are looking great here. We are also watching that vestibule depressurization, of course, complete now, holding at 5 psi. We're just looking at that thermal stabilization, just waiting for it to stabilize, balance out its swings, so we can get a nice solid leak check before continuing down close to vacuum. On the International Space Station side, we did close the A-Pass hatch, affixing that with a docking target. It's a rod with a little X at the end of it. Chris Cassidy performing those duties and taking some closeout photos, just making sure that everything was okay, checking the configuration, and that'll be reported to teams here on the ground so they understand the configuration for future crews to visit. He then loaded up that pressurized mating adapter. That was that tube that he was on the other side of which was closing the A-Pass hatch, putting some items in there for storage, and then eventually he did successfully close and lock the Node 2 forward hatch, completing his duties for the day. So he will be, of course, watching Bob and Doug depart the station. He'll be in the cupola module. This is that 7-bay window that looks right down on the Earth, provides a very good view of the Dragon departing from the forward end of the International Space Station. He'll have a camera right in his hand and be able to take some pictures as they depart the International Space Station. But the primary monitoring role will actually be in the hands of Bob and Doug, the Dragon vehicle being an autonomous departure vehicle, Bob and Doug being able to take control if necessary with the monitoring role, and then the backup monitoring role here in Mission Control Houston. So as soon as we continue this depressurization of the vestibule close to vacuum, just about 4:20 p.m. Pacific time, we're looking to conduct a go, no-go. That's, I think, a little bit less than an hour from now at this time that we'll conduct a go, no-go to start the undocking sequence. So the undocking sequence will be detaching the umbilical and then releasing 12 hooks in sets of 6, 2 sets of 6. There's going to be 2 pulses that are going to be fired from the Dragon end. They're called undocking burns, and they'll actually physically separate Dragon vehicle from the International Space Station. That's scheduled just a little bit after 4:30 p.m. Pacific time today. So far, everything looking good, holding steady right now, 5 psi, looking to continue that depressurization here soon. With that, everything looking good from the International Space Station Flight Control Room. We'll send it back over to Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that update. If you're just joining us, the Dragon spacecraft is currently forward hatch sealed. Earlier today, Bob and Doug had actually loaded some powered cargo into the vehicle, and the life support system is reactivated. And then after sealing the hatches on both the International Space Station side and stepping into the spacecraft, we did some leak checks on the suits to step into vestibule leak checks now.
Yeah, and so that vestibule area, we're holding at 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch to conduct and make sure that it is holding and not fluctuating due to any temperature changes. Actually, the crew on the International Space Station, as I mentioned earlier, this is evening for them. And so it's actually 10:30 almost aboard the International Space Station, 10:30 p.m. And so they'll be getting ready to go to sleep soon. The crew here in Crew Dragon got to take a 3-hour nap today in the middle of the day. Looks like actually the whole crew was able to enjoy that nap. That way they'd all be alert and ready to conduct these departure procedures, whether it be sealing up the hatches or conducting any of the leak checks, monitoring the ride home. We want to make sure the astronauts are well rested, and even though the crew on the International Space Station will get their sleep period soon, we'll see Bob and Doug get theirs. They'll have about 8 hours later tonight to get some shut-eye.
Yeah, that'll actually sleep shift them well before they start to step into the deorbit burn, which is actually the largest burn of the day and actually a pretty dynamic time for them. So I want to make sure that they are all well rested so they can monitor and step in if they have to take any contingency actions, and also read back on the status of the vehicle if ground control teams are unable to properly assess the health of the system. Of course, one of the nice things about having crew members aboard is they can see the health of the vehicle and they can respond. Bob and Doug able to issue commands via those touchscreen displays, and also getting quite a bit of training on potential emergency scenarios, wave-offs, scenarios where they might need to interact with Dragon, and if it were to lose comms or have a thruster issue. But right now, very healthy vehicle. haven't really seen any issues with Dragon during its 63-day stay at the International Space Station.
And if you are wondering, once Dragon departs today from the International Space Station, we're not going anywhere. We're actually going to be live all the way until they come home to Earth tomorrow. So some of the bigger things we can look forward to after undocking, we've got a couple of departure burns. The first two are going to bring Dragon up and over the International Space Station, and then the next two will bring it down and in front of the space station before a phasing burn later this afternoon to help it really sync up with its landing zone for tomorrow.
That's right. I think I might have heard a call.
Heard a little something.
Okay, there might be a call coming on the space to ground. We'll be sure to keep an eye out for that.
Looks like pressure in the vestibule is still holding.
Yeah, and so as part of those burns that they have to do, the first couple of burns are really just to adjust the apogee and the perigee. So the apogee, if you can imagine the orbit of a spacecraft as an ellipse going around the Earth, the apogee is the highest point, or the point farthest away from the planet, and the perigee is the lowest point. And so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station, of course, still docked, and they're in a roughly circular orbit. After the conclusion of these departure burns, Dragon's apogee will be about 10 kilometers below the International Space Station, but we'll be slowly reducing our perigee. And then later on tonight, Pacific time, we'll actually conduct what's called a phasing burn. And the goal there is to adjust the orientation of that orbit just so we get our orbital pathway to line up over the landing site, where we will, or line up with a path that will cross over the landing site, where we can, when we issue our departure burn sequence, we'll be able to line up landing off the coast of Florida near Pensacola.
As you can see, Bob Banken and Doug Hurley in their suits now, but after those first couple of departure burns, they'll actually be able to take off their suits, and they won't need to put them back on or don them again until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn. And then they'll wear them the entire rest of their ride home. But for the majority of the rest of the evening after the departure burns 1 and 2, they'll be able to take off those spacesuits, relax a little bit more, enjoy their ride in Crew Dragon. And while Crew Dragon was on the International Space Station, we actually conducted some habitability tests. Of course, there's 2 astronauts flying today, but our future crews are scheduled to have 4 astronauts. So we brought in a couple of the space station's current residents to test out what it's like to have multiple people in Dragon once it's in microgravity. Performed lots of tests inside the vehicle. They had a little sleep period to see how it would be to sleep with 4 people in the vehicle, and things went pretty well. Looking forward to that first Crew 1 launch later this year.
Yeah, so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station about 422 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And going about 7.6 kilometers per second. Should be close to that 17,500 number that you probably hear pretty often.
Yes, and if you're looking at miles, it looks like we're about 261 statute miles above the Earth. And they are in the South Pacific Ocean. They'll be coming up across Hawaii not too long from now.
There's a view from the International Space Station looking at the Dragon spacecraft. So Bob and Doug inside the portion towards the right of your screen. If you can imagine how they're seating upright, their displays would sort of be looking up towards the direction the nose cone is opened up. And behind them is the trunk of the spacecraft. So that top side, the black shiny part, is actually our solar panels on the body of the spacecraft. And below that, the white side of the spacecraft is the radiator. So that's where we're radiating away our heat generated by the avionics and the electronic hardware aboard the vehicle, and of course from Bob and Doug themselves. Generating a little bit of heat based on how much physical activity and exertion they're doing. Right now it looks like they're pretty comfortable, just kind of hanging out in their suits.
And actually, the vestibule leak check has started, and so they're testing to ensure the solidarity of those seals between the hatches. And as we saw earlier, they checked to make sure there was no foreign object debris or FOD, so that they would have a clean seal and be able to to complete this leak check successfully, another step toward undocking.
These leak checks should be pretty fast. They'll be looking to see if there's any pressure rise on the vestibule itself, which would indicate pressure coming through the forward hatch seal.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Vestibule thermal stabilization is complete and the leak check period has started. Additionally, the Dragon to ground path is now available. If you would like to swap one of your audio destinations to Dragon to ground, I am happy to support a comm check at this time.
Okay, Bob will do that.
SpaceX, Dragon, Comm Checks, Dragon to ground.
I hear you loud and clear. How me?
And Anna, you came in very quiet. I'll bump up that channel and maybe we could try it again.
Copy. How is this?
That's a little bit better, Anna, but got it cranked up to be able to hear you just for your awareness. A little bit different volume between the big loop and hearing you on the big loop and hearing you on Dragon to ground.
Copy. I will make sure to talk loudly into the Dragon to ground path.
And Dragon, Houston on Dragon to ground for a comm check. How do you copy me?
And Houston, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground.
Actually, my bad. I was not on the correct loop. Comm check again on Dragon to ground from Houston.
Okay, Leslie, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground. Much clearer, much less echo on this loop than the big loop.
That's a good data point, and we also have you loud and clear down here.
So we just heard some comm checks between the crew aboard the Crew Dragon and the core here on the ground, and then with the Capcom in Houston. They're two very similar positions. We call ours the Capcom because it stands for Capsule Communicator, and we are in a capsule once again. For a few years there, obviously we were flying a space shuttle, so not quite a capsule, but before that we had Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all capsules, and this person was once used to be typically an astronaut so that they could communicate any specific details about the vehicle, especially based on their previous experience. Now we have Capcoms who are not necessarily astronauts, but obviously very, very well studied in the vehicle.
Yeah, the way we refer to them is the crew's advocate on the ground. They're trying to think of things ahead of their crew and have information that the crew might need where but they tend to act as the advocate for the crew on the ground, letting them know where equipment might be stored in the vehicle, letting them know of upcoming steps. If there's any troubleshooting that the crew need to do or information that the crew need, they interact with the crew. Typically also train very closely with the crew in simulations and also during their training periods to get them familiar with all of the procedures that they need to operate in the spacecraft. Now, during those comm checks, there was some discussion about the big loop and Dragon to ground and space to ground, a lot of different loops. Really what a loop just refers to is a communications link. Operators all have the ability to talk on these loops and provide real-time communication. Usually they are redundant loops, so if you had a problem with one of the comm systems, then there's a redundant backup so you can ensure you have good voice communication with the crew. And once we get away from space station outside of the keep-out sphere and the approach ellipsoid, we'll actually transition to what's referred to as Dragon to ground. So we'll be issuing a lot of that communication via Dragon's transmitters through those TDRS satellites back to ground.
So as we mentioned earlier, 63 days aboard the International Space Station for these two spacefarers. Was not their first flight. They'd both had 2 previous shuttle missions, and they both have families that are very excited to see them once they get home. I know some folks here around at SpaceX refer to them as the space dads. Both have young boys, and I know that they have to be excited to get back to their families soon.
And the space dads actually brought a cool zero-G indicator up with them. An apatosaurus, a kind of sparkly apatosaurus, who was sitting in the seat next to them for the ride up. And as I understand, their sons actually voted that that was going to be the zero-G indicator between the two of them.
They're also bringing something really interesting and with a lot of history to it back to the ground. There was an American flag aboard the International Space Station that flew on the first space shuttle mission and the final space shuttle mission, and it was left aboard the space station. That way it could be retrieved by the next crew who launched from America, and so they are also bringing home that piece of history as well.
Yeah, so I was looking up some facts earlier. The first space shuttle mission in April 1981. So that flag has been to space quite a while, and it's been on station now for about 9 years, which is a pretty long time to be in space.
Yeah, it's probably traveled more miles than any human ever, or any astronaut ever, for sure.
So if you're just joining us, we're currently looking at 2 views inside the Dragon spacecraft. Right now in the seats are spacecraft commander Doug Hurley on the left-hand side, or in the left-hand seat, and Banken, the Joint Operations Commander, in the right-hand seat. The crew got on board. They've had a relatively busy day packing cargo on board the spacecraft. They closed the forward hatch and the APAS hatch on the pressurized mating adapter on the International Space Station side. And they're currently in the middle of a vestibule leak check. So vestibule, the space in between the 2 spacecraft, the 2 spacecraft being the International Space Station and Dragon. So we've brought that down to about 5 psi at this point, and verifying that there's no leakage from either side.
The International Space Station is also in the current proper configuration for that departure. They do something called feathering the solar arrays, and so what they do is they turn and lock them at an angle. That way, when Dragon leaves the space station, obviously it's going to use its thrusters, and those thrusters have exhaust that are emitted, and we don't want those to contaminate any of the solar cells on the arrays because that makes them less functional. They can't perform as well if they're coated in exhaust, and so those exhaust plumes avoid the solar arrays because they are feathered, and we also just don't want to put extra stress on the solar arrays. So it sounds like the International Space Station and is set up well for the upcoming departure of Crew Dragon.
And as kind of a preview of what's happening on the ground side, so operators and mission control in Houston, and of course operators here in mission control on Hawthorne, looking at the health of the vehicle systems. Right now we are in what are called joint operations because of our proximity to the International Space Station. And so in joint operations, the flight director out of Houston is actually the prime authority for any commanding or anything that'll occur up in space close to the International Space Station. So both teams are conducting health checks against a set of what we refer to as flight rules to check on the health of the vehicle, configuration of the vehicle, and then verifying that their procedures are go for undocking. All those checks happening concurrently with this leak check.
Yeah, and we'll be in those joint operations through the exit of the approach ellipsoid. So there are two invisible lines, sort of, that vehicles cross upon arrival and departure from the International Space Station, and these help us govern, we have specific rules for each one that the vehicle shouldn't cross if they violate any of those. And so some of those, for the keep-out sphere, that smaller sphere around the space station, we call that for orbit safe. So if the Dragon were for some reason lose control of any of its thrusters, it would be safe for 4 orbits if like not hitting the International Space Station if it's inside that keep-out sphere. And then the approach ellipsoid has a little bit of a lesser time frame. You need to be 24 hours safe. And that gives time for the teams on the ground to troubleshoot anything that might arise, as we mentioned, if there were some reason they couldn't send commands to the vehicle or the vehicle couldn't be commanded by the astronauts. So those are typically hold points on the way up for our visiting vehicles. But on the way home, we won't be stopping any. We'll be heading straight for Earth with a splashdown planned for tomorrow.
Here's an external view of the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. That structure that you see, kind of hemispherical structure on the top, is actually the nose cone. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is that pressurized mating adapter that we saw the crew in earlier. So Commander Chris Cassidy aboard the space station, closing the APAS hatch and Node 2 forward hatch on those two. And of course, Bob and Doug closing the Dragon forward hatch. And much later on in the mission, right before we are planning to step into, right before we really re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, we'll end up closing that nose cone to protect the sensors and thrusters that live underneath it.
Another thing we'll also see happen is the jettison of the trunk. And so the trunk was on the end of Crew Dragon. You could see it had the solar cells wrapped around it, helping Dragon gather power from the sun. And that'll be removed. You can see it again. It's got some fins on it back there. That will not return to Earth with the Crew Dragon capsule. That will actually burn up upon reentry into the Earth's atmosphere. And that's where, on the way up, we would be able to store any unpressurized cargo. So if there were something that we'd like to install on the outside of the International Space Station, that would be a good place to put it, and the astronauts could use that. It's an extra trunk. I mean, it's exactly what it is. So it's not for any of their personal luggage, but it's great for any of that unpressurized cargo.
Yeah, those aerodynamic fins are actually pretty important. If there were a launch escape event, those aerodynamic fins provide stability to the vehicle as it were to separate from Falcon 9. Of course, we didn't need to see that during this mission, and hopefully we won't see that ever since the in-flight abort mission that happened. And the back on the trunk also contains the thermal coolant loops for the vehicle, so we radiate away heat to space. Of course, on planet Earth, you can sort of just push a breeze by you to get some nice cooling, but in space you have to radiate away all that heat because it's a vacuum around you, so you can't take advantage of convective heat transfer away from the spacecraft. Although, interesting tidbit, there is just enough of an atmosphere to be a drag, and actually the International Space Station needs to do periodic reboosts to stay in its orbit, right?
And they did one of those very recently. That was factored into Dragon's departure procedures as the International Space Station used its thrusters to reboost it, and in preparation for this October, when it will have a Soyuz vehicle arrive with some brand new crew members. And so this was factored into Dragon's departure sequence, knowing at which altitude the International Space Station would be flying. And it looks right now the International Space Station is flying 262 statute miles over the North Pacific Ocean. It looks like they will be crossing into North America soon, and specifically coming up over the coast of Oregon.
A kind of a preview of what's coming up next. Currently conducting a leak check of the vestibule. Now, particularly important because any breathable gas that you bring with you into space is what you bring on your spaceship. So the International Space Station with the supply of breathable gases, and of course Dragon with tanks aboard that contain nitrogen and oxygen, and the life support system providing periodic injections of oxygen to keep the cabin at about 20 to 25% oxygen, which is about what we would have actually here on Earth. So doing a leak check, making sure that we're not losing any of that precious breathable gas through the forward hatch seal, which has been open really this entire time while we've been on space station.
We've seen a few milestones happen so far today. Of course, we've got a lot to look forward to, but we saw the Dragon hatch close earlier after Bob and Doug were safely inside. Shortly thereafter, Chris Cassidy closed the space station side. That's the APAS hatch, and then eventually the Node 2 hatch. That allowed us to step into this vestibule depressurization period, bringing that space in between those hatches down to as close to a vacuum as we can possibly bring it before departure later. So yes, now conducting those leak checks, and then we will be looking for a go, no go for undock coming up at 4:20 Pacific.
So during that go, no go for undocking, ground operators will be looking at the health of the vehicle systems, verifying that everything seems pressure and leak tight, verifying the configurations of both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And then we'll actually expect to hear a call up to the crew, see if they're ready to come on home. And then ground operators here in Hawthorne will issue a command to the Dragon spacecraft that will begin the process of detaching the umbilicals that are providing power and telemetry from the space station to the Dragon spacecraft, and then actually removing those 12 hard capture hooks that are keeping the vestibule leak tight right now. And Dragon will do a couple of undocking burns as well, short little thrusts.
Yes, two.
From the surface section.
Very short. Will actually specifically be 1.5 seconds and then another for 5 seconds. So I think Gary described them earlier as pulses. I think that's a great way to describe them rather than necessarily as long as a burn. But even our departure burns later are short to start off with. Departure burn 0 looking to be about 12 seconds long, and then departure burn 1 for 20 seconds. And those increase the opening rate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. And after that departure burn 1, they can take off their suits, get comfortable, and relax until time for that deorbit burn tomorrow.
Yeah, the deorbit burn is a pretty big burn, and the departure phasing burn is actually a very large burn. Departure phasing should last about 6 minutes or so, and the deorbit burn will actually be on the order of 9 to 10 minutes. Definitely the largest thrusts of at least the return portion of the mission. And for the phasing burn, that's really to line us up with our potential landing site over Pensacola in the Gulf of Mexico. And the deorbit burn will reduce our perigee, or the lowest point of Dragon's orbit, so that we end up getting caught by the Earth's atmosphere. Dragon will actually then get a chance to use its heat shield and slow down against the Earth's atmosphere. And then once we get to the right sort of pressure characteristics and altitude characteristics as sensed by the vehicle, then we'll have the drogue chutes deploy, slow us down even further before finally seeing those 4 main chutes deploy. That'll bring Dragon down to a nice gentle landing in the ocean.
And I learned something really interesting about parachutes. So whenever you see those drogue chutes deploy, they don't automatically inflate right away. That's because they're doing something called reefing, and that keeps the air from flowing into the parachute too quickly and shocking the parachute system on Crew Dragon. So they expand very slowly and begin to slow the vehicle down rather than all at once and giving a jolt to the spacecraft.
Yeah, and actually even with the drogue chutes and the main chutes opening slowly, Bob and Doug will still experience somewhere between 4 and 5 Gs of acceleration. So, 1 G is what we experience sort of just standing here. If you can imagine yourself being 4 times or 5 times as heavy just for that brief period of time, that's about how much force they'll experience. Of course, both of them test pilots. Test pilots usually train up to, depending on if you're in the Navy or the Air Force, 7 to 9 Gs. So nothing that they're probably unfamiliar with.
So So you've got this really good close-up view of Crew Dragon attached to the International Space Station. That's the Node 2 forward hatch. You can see the nose cone is open. That will be closed later after the departure burn and prior to re-entry, but that is how the astronauts ingressed or entered the International Space Station when they arrived 63 days ago, and how they exited the space station when they prepare to depart today. So this is a great view, and that's where we will begin to see some movement once that undocking command is sent later this afternoon. So some more facts about our astronauts today. We mentioned that they have had 2 previous flights on the space shuttle, and this is their first flight not on a space shuttle, and so they both just logged 63 days aboard the space station. It'll be 64 by the time they return home. So Doug Hurley will have a total of 93 days in space over his 3 space flights, 2 on the shuttles, including that last shuttle mission. And then Bob Banken will have logged a total of 92 days in space over his 3 flights. So very close there. But adding up some time aboard the International Space Station.
And Bob Banken actually getting some pretty cool opportunities to conduct a number of spacewalks with Chris Cassidy, going outside the space station, conducting some work to replace power units and batteries on the space station?
Yes, they actually replaced some older nickel-hydrogen batteries with some newer lithium-ion batteries, and these upgrades have been going on for a few years now. And the astronauts were very efficient. They conducted 4 spacewalks, Chris Cassidy and Bob Banken. And in the meantime, Doug Hurley was inside, and he was controlling the Canadarm2. That's the robotic arm on the International Space Station. And so all 3 with a very important role in those spacewalks. And it became quite a milestone for Banken and Cassidy. They both now have conducted 10 spacewalks in their career, and that ties them with the most spacewalks by an American astronaut. They're now tied with 10 with Mike Lopez Alegria and Peggy Whitson.
Dragon SpaceX, we had a good vestibule leak check.
I can copy. Good news. Thank you.
There's confirmation from the core of successful leak check on the vestibule. That means 1 more milestone down and getting ready for undock.
Yeah, and that wraps up the completion of those leak checks, as you mentioned, in that small space between Crew Dragon and the space station, the vestibule. It was brought down from a pressure of, it looked like 14.1 pounds per square inch, and then to 5. So they had that hold period and then conducted leak checks. But that 14.1 was the same as the rest of the station. Now they are offset quite a bit, and so they're going to bring that all the way down to vacuum, since that's what they will be exposed to, the hatches, once Crew Dragon Endeavour begins its journey home.
Yeah, and actually, if we didn't bring that space down to vacuum, then it would almost act like a thruster. There'd be a little bit of pressure left up in there, and so as the seals came, or as the seals were sort of opened up and we removed those hard capture hooks, we'd see a little propulsive thrust. And of course, being this close to station, we want every maneuver to be very carefully choreographed. So trying to make sure there's as little energy imparted by that little bit of pressure in the mating adapter. So actually, now would be a great time to hear what's going on at Mission Control Houston and get an update on the space station. Gary, can you let us know how it's going?
Hey, Shiva, we're watching the depressurization of the vestibule now. It's a little bit less than 4.5 psi, a little bit slower than what we saw just a little bit an hour ago when we went from about the pressure of sea level down to 5 psi. That really only taking a few minutes. This one's a little bit slower, but we are seeing a good depressurization of the vestibule, those all being controlled from the Dragon side, and we're monitoring here from Mission Control Houston. Now, some of the views you might see from the outside of the International Space Station looking at the Dragon vehicle, some of those cameras being controlled from Mission Control in Japan. Working from here in Mission Control Houston with the Japanese Mission Control Room to make sure we're going to get good views with those cameras. We're going to get a little pan as the Dragon makes its way away from the International Space Station, and that first departure burn 0, brings it a little bit faster away from the station. We'll get a nice view from the Japanese side of the International Space Station. Right now, the International Space Station configured for undocking. We do have those solar arrays feathered. That's in a locked position.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Endeavour's undock sequence start time is planned for 23:30 GMT. That is 28 minutes from now.
You heard that from Capcom here in Mission Control Houston. That is Leslie Ringo here in Mission Control Houston. That start time is 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. Central. That is the on-time start time for the undocking sequence. Once that kicks off, that'll be the initiation of the umbilical retraction, followed by 12 hooks that are keeping Dragon in place attached to the International Space Station. Those will drive and be released 6 at a time. They're in 2 gangs. And then, of course, there's 2 undocking burns, more like pulses, just short little burps that are going to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station vehicle. You can hear right now everything going according to plan. We're right on the timeline. That physical separation, as long as we're on the timeline, should happen at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going well. We'll continue to monitor the depressurization of the vestibule from here in Mission Control Houston. Until then, we'll send it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. So once Bob Banken and Doug Hurley arrived at the space station on May 31st, it did not take them long to get to work. During the time on board the orbiting laboratory, as we mentioned, Bob Banken ventured outside the hatch 4 times for spacewalks to upgrade those batteries, and Doug Hurley used the Canadarm2 to command the station's robotic arm from the inside of the station. But when they weren't focusing on the outside of the station, they continued science and research inside the orbiting laboratory. Of course, as we mentioned, they also exercised the mandatory 2 hours each day. And many of you have seen some of the incredible pictures that they took of our home planet. This is one beautiful view of a sun glint off the ocean. And then there's also one that we have from Comet Neowise in July. If you had the opportunity to see that from the ground, we saw our astronauts had a great shot of that from the International Space Station.
Yeah, they had some really cool opportunities. We're sharing a lot of those photos on Twitter. And of course, you know, earlier this morning as they've been preparing for undocking, they had some work to do as well in packing cargo into the Dragon spacecraft. So underneath their seats, they've got room for powered and unpowered cargo. Right now, they're bringing home about 150 kilograms or about 330 pounds of cargo. Most of that is science and sampling hardware. About 94 kilograms or about 200 pounds of it is science that's happening aboard the space station. And Dragon does have the ability to return a lot of that cargo, so it can come back to labs here on Earth who can continue to do human science studies on those biological samples and cold sample studies on those cold samples that they're returning. And it's really something that we've been doing even since our previous version of Cargo Dragon, just continuing that capability with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to mention. When the astronauts know that there is a Crew Dragon or a Cargo Dragon vehicle coming, they know it's about to get really busy with a lot of science. Because Cargo Dragon is currently the only vehicle cargo resupply ship we have that can bring back cargo. The others disintegrate, burn up in the Earth's atmosphere upon reentry. So we mentioned earlier that Comet Neowise picture, and I think we have it now. Look at how beautiful that is, the comet streaking across the sky just above the Earth below. I can't imagine.
Yeah, especially to see the glow of the Earth's atmosphere kind of creating that blue sheen as the light refracts off of it. Really cool.
And this was probably taken from the cupola window, and that's, as Gary mentioned, that bay window area on the International Space Station that faces down toward Earth. It's truly the best view in the house. Chris Cassidy might head over there after undocking today to take a look outside and watch as his friends depart. We saw that on the way uphill. He was in there monitoring their arrival and taking some pictures of Crew Dragon as it arrived as well. But aside from all of that science talk, we'll also be returning some vehicle hardware like spacewalking cooling garments, which the astronauts wear under their extravehicular mobility unit suits. There's tubes of water that they can control the temperature of. So when they are in the sun outside of the space station, it can be up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And when they are in the darkness and outside the space station, it can be negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So that cooling garment is also, in a way, a little bit of a heating garment and can help them control their temperature when they're outside on a spacewalk. So we'll be returning some of those. Also some glove connectors for refurbishment back on Earth, and along with any crew provisions like food, small electronics, and even their sleeping bags. NASA will have cargo specialists embedded with the recovery team. They'll be able to quickly recover and unload that returned cargo very shortly after Dragon returns on the recovery ship to shore tomorrow.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. You're mentioning the wide temperature variations. That's something you don't really see on Earth because we have air and we have humidity in the air that helps us sort of regulate that temperature. Of course, you don't have all that humidity and atmosphere around you to help with that. So when you're in the sun, you're getting the full brunt of that heat, and when you're not, you're getting the full coolness of being in eclipse. And so that's part of the reason why you need those extra vehicular suits, as well as like the thermal systems on Dragon, to help regulate that temperature into something that is palatable for humans.
And speaking of heat and atmosphere, when the astronauts re-enter tomorrow, they will be traveling, or they will experience temperatures up to 3,500 degrees outside the crew vehicle. Inside it'll be nice and cool. They've got some air conditioning, and their suits will have cooled air venting through them. So that's a pretty fiery re-entry tomorrow.
Another view on your screen of the Dragon spacecraft, and now looking at a camera that's positioned just behind Bob and Doug. So Doug in the left-hand seat, Bob in the right-hand seat, monitoring the vehicle. Looks like they've got the forward view, so on each of their individual panels. You can sort of tell that because it looks like they've got an attitude ring in front of them. And then they've got a view in the middle that has their procedures and cue cards up for what they can expect next. And speaking of which, actually, so then the next thing we'll really see here is final configuration for undocking. So there'll be a go, no-go poll for issuing that final configuration. We're expecting that to happen, the actual command to occur right on time at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time. And then shortly after that, we'll have a couple of those undocking bursts that will just separate any sort of friction, any sort of forces that may have statically built up while Dragon's been hanging out on station. And separation is planned for 4:34 p.m. Pacific time, 4:34 and 58 seconds, actually.
Yes, so from the time that command is sent from the ground to start undocking, as you mentioned, those hooks have to be retracted, those 12 hooks, 2 sets of 6. The umbilical that has been providing power to Dragon from the International Space Station will detach, and they will use those 2 short bursts to begin their journey home.
Yeah, and a lot of those steps are automated. Once we issue the command for undocking configuration, operators here in Mission Control will be monitoring that Dragon performs the correct state transitions. Dragon